Good evening. We are living through times for which we search for historic parallels. The civil strife of the 1960s, the pandemic of 1918, the depression of the 1930s. Good evening. All of the above? None of the above? I like to believe that we at Micah try to consider our lives and our times through the wisdom, insight, and inspiration of our Jewish religious heritage. And when we at Micah think about ourselves religiously, or attempt to think about ourselves even theologically, we regularly turn to thinkers and teachers in other faith communities as well, in order to learn from them and help their thinking inform our own. This evening, we have created for ourselves just such an opportunity. We have two people with us who are no strangers to our community, but are in fact dear friends. We might even say that Rabbi Hoffman is our rabbi's rabbi. We know him so well. He has been with us so many times, and his influence is felt in almost everything we do or say. Rabbi Hoffman is, in a word, the leading thinker in the world of Reform Judaism today. His primary area of scholarship is liturgy, but his writing and teaching spans many fields, and we are more than honored to have him with us. Dr. Diana Butler Bass is one of the leading thinkers, writers, and scholars in contemporary Christian religious thought. She too has been a regular teacher and speaker within our Micah community. Her writings have greatly impacted all of our rabbis as well. I regularly, in fact, give one of her books as a gift to graduating rabbinical students. Dr. Butler Bass is in fact a regular teacher that Rabbi Hoffman introduces the Tisch Rabbinic Fellows to each year. Her writings therefore influence rabbis across our country. We could not have not only two smarter people with us this evening, but we could not have with us two more humane and decent people to help advise our own personal and communal search for faith in the time of turmoil that we are living through. Helping us this evening, and this was Rabbi Hoffman's wise idea, is our summer rabbinical school intern, Becky, Jaye. She will be with us. Rabbi Hoffman wisely thought that we should hear from a younger generation as well. We'll begin with presentations from Dr. Bass and Rabbi Hoffman. They will engage in conversation with each other. Becky and I will at times post questions for them. We'll save time at the end for your questions, so please type them into the chat box. They'll be forwarded to us. We'll end our evening with a prayer. Many thanks for tuning in. We begin with Dr. Butler Bass. She'll inform us the religious, theological questions that she is grappling with in this turmoil time for all of us. Dr. Bass, thank you so much.
There we go. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. And it is a really interesting thing to talk about faith, you know, as a Christian with my Jewish friends and neighbors. In certain ways, the issues that one might expect me to bring up would be related to things I've shared with Micah in the past. And that is, for instance, my book on being grounded. What does it mean to be spiritually grounded? Or the practice of gratitude, because that is obviously something as a spiritual practice that crosses the boundaries of being Christian or Jewish and brings us into human territory together. And both of those things, being grounded and being grateful, has helped me personally get through these weeks of the pandemic. Indeed, gratitude has emerged as a much stronger and even more important spiritual practice in my own life. But I wanted to share with you something a little different. In some ways, it's a little bit more specifically Christian, but it also is raising some very interesting questions, I think, that are much bigger than just Christianity. And as I talk about this, I'll have to do a little bit of explaining about a Christian practice. But if you'll bear with me, I don't want to get caught up in the theological minutia of it. Instead, to ask us all together, because I actually could really use a community to talk to about these questions, to use this incident that's going on right now, this episode in Christian community, as a way of getting towards issues about God and what it means to be people of faith together in this difficult time. Both Rabbi Zemel and Rabbi Hoffman asked me what was happening in Christian community in regard to the pandemic. And the first thing that I started talking about with an incredible amount of passion is the fact that certain Christian denominations, Catholics, Episcopalians, Orthodox, and Lutherans, these are the very sort of high church, more traditional, hierarchically arranged sorts of denominations in the Christian family. Those denominations have all forbidden practicing the Lord's Supper or the meal of the Eucharist during the pandemic. This is a really interesting problem for them because each one of these denominations places this ritual as the central point of Christian spirituality and Christian faith. As a matter of fact, when we gather in church in those different denominations, every single week, that's the ritual that we celebrate. That's what the Catholics call Mass. Episcopalians refer to as Eucharist. Lutherans call usually Holy Communion. And what happens in that ritual is we gather around a table and we share bread and wine. And Christians believe that we uniquely encounter God in that sacred meal in a way that we don't encounter God in other times and other places. And so it's a really important grounding ritual for the community and for all of us as individuals. So what has happened is that like Micah, all Christian churches have gone online. So as synagogues have gone online in recent weeks, so have churches. And we are all going, in effect, as Christians to church every week. So we can sing sitting in our offices or our living rooms. We can read the Bible. We can hear sermons. We can pray together. But these specific denominations have said that there will be no celebration of this common meal. And that has created, if you can believe it or not, a huge argument across these denominations. Not only have people been sort of insisting that we be able to celebrate this ritual through online, lots of lay people have been arguing, saying, yeah, you have to give the people the ability to be able to celebrate this ritual. The denominations themselves are saying, no, it can't be done. And there was even in the Episcopal Church, two different bishops, those are the hierarchical sort of overseers in particular regions of the church, two different bishops who were actually threatened by the institution to be brought up on ecclesiastical charges against them for wanting to celebrate the Lord's Supper with people over the internet. And it seems like a sort of, and it is in some ways a sort of tempest in a teapot. And there is a lot of theological reason why people don't want to do it. But the bigger two reasons that sort of keep popping to the surface as I listen to people having this fight, and to be perfectly honest, I have been leading the fight in favor of doing the Lord's Supper via the internet. The two questions that keep emerging in the argument always seem to be the same. And the first one is, can God work through this technology? And there are many people, I happen to be an Episcopalian, there are many people in my denomination who literally believe that that God cannot be mediated through the internet, and that the only way that God can be present is if we are physically gathered in the same room together with our physical and bodily presence. And so any other way in which God could be present to us, the church is literally telling the rest of all of its members that God cannot use this medium to as a spiritual vehicle in which this important ritual could be celebrated. And that's a kind of astonishing question to me, is that the idea that God, who creates the whole universe, can't use the internet to bless bread and wine. But nevertheless, that is the decision that the National Episcopal Church has made and said, no, God cannot be present through this medium. And that leads on to a second question, and it's also about this same medium. And I think that this one is probably even a little bit more relevant in terms of Micah. And this is the idea that somehow the ways in which we have been gathering over these last few months is not real. The church has actually begun making a distinction between virtuality and what is real. And so there is running around in many Christian circles this idea that this kind of community that happens via the internet is less than other forms of community that human beings make. This is, I think, a huge issue for all of us going forward, even if we could gather again in synagogues and churches. We all know that there are going to be limitations on that for quite a few months to come, and that there are going to be people who do find this form of community to be helpful and good because of disabilities, perhaps, or illness, being shut in, people who are far away. And so there is right now this very interesting thing that's developing, is that people who have been sort of outside the reach of this in real life kind of community have actually been brought into community through the internet, and that we're going to have to be able to understand how these two forms of community, virtual community and in real life community, relate to one another, and how we support one another, how we experience God together, how we pray together, and of course, how we go forth and do the kind of good work in the world that we're supposed to do together, even when we are in this kind of blended economy. And for me, I've really struggled through some interesting questions about whether or not the technology mediates for us something that is real in terms of human interaction. And I just keep, this is where I want to close with my first remarks. I keep thinking about what counts as being real and what counts as being real community. And one of the huge things that's entered into all of our consciousnesses in recent weeks is the death of George Floyd. And I keep looking at that video of him dying, and I have realized, of course, what the way in which his death was mediated to us was through the internet. If it wasn't for a cell phone camera, and if it wasn't for video feed, if it wasn't for looking at this on our computers or our phones or on television, there would not have been thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people in America's streets over recent weeks. In other words, we felt the real death of George Floyd. And his real death moved us as human beings to want to do something, to change things, and that we feel the injustice of the whole thing, as well as the sadness and grief. And so here is my church saying that one, God cannot be mediated through this technology, and so therefore we have no access to the central ritual of Christian community. And second of all, because the community is not gathered in a building, that we cannot consider it to be equally legitimate community as if we were sitting in pews together singing songs. And so that's what I'm really thinking about right now. I'm thinking about spiritual practices that keep me on track, like gratitude, but more I'm thinking about these two really important questions. Where is God, and how does the presence of God come to us now? And then second of all, what is community? And how do we recognize the real power and depth of the kinds of community we're creating at this moment through this shifted technology that we've all had to embrace in the last 2 months?
Wow, what a beginning. Thank you very much, Dr. Bass, Diana, and Rabbi Zemel, to Danny, who's thought this idea up, and to student Rabbi Becky, Jaye, we'll hear from later on, and Deborah Winter, who's going to close with the prayer, I believe. But most of all, I want to thank Temple Micah. Temple Micah is really my synagogue, home away from home, and I feel as if I belong there. So I feel right at home with this. Diana, I think we can be on first name basis. We know each other so well. It's such a pleasure to be with you, and I learn from you always, and I'm inclined to immediately jump in and respond to your remarks, but I think we have a time to do that later. So I want to add something from a very Jewish perspective, as you added something from a Christian perspective. So what might be a Jewish perspective for all of this? Well, I think the first thing I want to talk about is the problem Jews have with the very question that we're facing today. I mean, we're supposed to be talking specifically about faith. And the problem is that for many Jews, they don't know how to do that. As a matter of fact, there's a specifically Jewish malady. I think it is a malady. And I'm not sure whether it affects some Christians as well. You can decide that, and others can tell us that. But our topic tonight is faith. And the fact is, Jews don't do faith very well. I remember when David Gregory, who's here at Micah, wrote his book, How's Your Faith? Any number of people said to me, that's no Jewish title. Are you sure he's Jewish? I mean, Jews simply don't talk much about faith because they think that it presupposes theological belief. And for any number of reasons that maybe we can talk about later, Jews are not sure they believe in anything theological, in God first and foremost. So you, Diana, ask where God is. Jews may wonder about that too, but they're certainly not likely to ask out loud. Average everyday Jews almost never talk about God. They largely just don't know how. They were never trained to do it. They mostly don't discuss faith because they mostly won't discuss belief. So I want to start by saying that actually, the truth of the matter is, faith has very little to do with belief. I think faith is a perspective more than anything else on our future. It is being able to paint a picture of your world or tell a story about your life where there's a future worth living for. It has nothing to do with the facts. I mean, facts are challenging sometimes, like the facts we're in right now. But whatever the facts are, any fact can become any sort of picture or story that we want. And we're the ones who paint the canvas. We devise the plot line of our lives. So faith at any time and place, now in our broken and plague-struck and morally deficient country, for example, faith at any time and place is a redeeming snapshot, I would say, drawn from our picture or story on the human condition. So we all share the human condition, and religion gives us a picture of it. And faith is the perspective on the future that arises out of a healthy religious picture. Theology is just the palette of colors. It's the words and the images from which we paint our religious pictures in the first place. It's how we approach questions like, why do good things happen to bad people? Is life worth living? Why bother with it altogether? What's it all about, Alfie? You know, are human beings good or bad? What do you think? Is anything eternal? Worth dying for even? So theology or God talk is the way we raise the ante of our conversation to make a picture that does justice to all of that sort of thing. I have an example. I had a student once, Rabbi Janine Schloss now in St. Louis. I remember this story so well. She went home to visit her grandmother, 93 years of age. She had been in love with what we had said in class about pronouncing blessings. She came back on Monday excited and she said, I saw my grandmother and what did I do? She said, I grabbed her in my arms and I said, blessed is God who gives me a grandmother of 93 years old. And she said, we cried, it was beautiful. And I had to think that sure beats, hey, grandma, how are you? Or gee, I'm glad to be here. Or how lucky. That's a theological thing to say, blessed is God who gave me. And it raises the ante of the whole thing. So my first point has been that faith, I think, is the marshaling of resources to paint a cosmic picture that gives us hope. And it arises out of religious conversation, particularly this lofty language of faith, or of theology better, which is a word picture. That's what it is. It's an art, a word picture that's best capable of doing justice to ultimate things in our lives that otherwise we just won't get at. So Jews should do theology. And I think if they did, they would have a loftier picture of how to live. So my second and third point are examples of how to speak theologically about this period we're living through. We called it faith in a time of COVID, something like that. And so what kind of faith could I get? What kind of pictures could I draw? Well, I'll start with Jewish peoplehood. I mean, this responds also to the question that Diana, you asked, where is God? It's a Jewish take on it, if you like. So I have a picture of my Jewish theology in which the Jewish people is very, very important. Jews will take endless courses in Jewish history. Anybody on this call who's Jewish remembers at least one course in Jewish history they took, if not 50. I mean, one after the other after the other. And history is like the queen of sciences in rabbinic school. You got to know Jewish history, all right? But what they don't do is take a course in the theology of it, because that's theology. So let's try out theology of Jewish history. If Jewish history is about anything, it's about exile. And in fact, that's what most humans fear most, exile, having no home, forced out on our own, being all alone, being a refugee in our time and place. We know all about it from the newspapers. Then why won't God help us, we wonder? Where is God when God is most needed? That's the exile theme of Jewish history, but it's also the human condition. So I think theologically of Jewish history as a template for humanity writ large. So one Jewish answer to why God doesn't swoop in to save us from exile is simple. God just doesn't work that way. God let us be exiled by the Babylonians, by the Romans, as part of some master plan that we know nothing about. Some Jews thought it was punishment, by the way, that God micromanages the universe, and that in micromanaging the universe, God decided to punish us and send us into exile. But there's another answer that I like better, and I'm happy that Judaism gives me more than one answer. The other answer is the very reverse. God just doesn't micromanage anything. God shrunk back and let the world take place. I mean, God established the universe with ironclad laws of nature. God just lets the laws operate. So God won't change history because God can't change history or the laws wouldn't work. But God does, as the Talmud puts it, a picture, see, a theological picture. God does go into exile with us. And so I'm here in exile, but I think, as you say, God is by my side, maybe reading my screen for all I know, but holding my hand, as it were, in exile. And COVID is exile. It's exile from community, our churches, our synagogues, as you pointed out, but it's exile even from our families, because I got a grandparent on one coast and another one on another coast. My kids are God knows where, and someone's sick and we can't see one another except in 2 dimensions. So it's too bad that God doesn't intervene in history to end COVID, but it doesn't matter how hard we pray. God just does not work that way. So now what? Where are we? Well, in a moment. Look theologically with me at the story of Adam and Eve. Why do we have it? I mean, they're not Jews. Why does the Jewish Bible bother starting with them? And the answer is, I mean, why not start with Abraham and Sarah, right? But the answer is that the first story about people in our Bible is about exile, exile from Eden. If you read literature, you're reading the Bible and you see, dramatic foreshadowing of Israel's history ever after. Aha! You're supposed to say as you read it, Israel's going to be exiled at the end of the book. I can see it happening now. And guess what? Israel is to Babylonia. But the book doesn't end there. The book ends with Israel coming back home. And the message is, theologically, we are all in exile. Exile happens all the time, but it ends someday. So I draw my picture of hope. Exile will end, COVID will end. And meanwhile, understanding exile better, we appreciate the need to be kind, to build community, to help those around us, to care for those who live alone, mind you, for refugees someday, for people who know exile, even as Jews do. And when we're out of exile with COVID, they're still going to be in it. We have to care for them. But now more hope. Because secondly, we note that Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge prior to the fall. Eating of the tree is what caused the fall. But the thing is, Jews never called it a fall. That's a Christian term. So I have to figure out what to call it. And I'll make the point that maybe it was the other way around. It was a step upward. Maybe it was a step forward, as it were, into human history. It's like we had to be exiled from the ideal paradise of Eden in order to grow up. Eden was our cocoon. God doesn't fix the broken world into which we are exiled, so we have to do it. And the only way to do that is by knowing the secrets of knowledge. It's through knowledge that we human beings will finally redeem the world. God sets up natural laws, retreats from the world, but allows us to finish creating it. We are the species entrusted to discover the secrets of the universe. Another image from Jewish ritual. It's like the afikomen, the piece of matzah that we save for the end of the meal. We go and we look for it at the end, and we get rewarded if we find it. I think the world is filled with afikomens, and they're the laws of nature that we are supposed to find. And when we find it, God chuckles and God says to us, good, you found another secret of mine. I hid it away for you. And the goal is to taste that tree of knowledge and find God's secrets. And ultimate exile will end someday, but because of knowledge, of science, of taking God's laws as seriously as God does when God doesn't intervene in them. So my next point is COVID is exile. God won't fix it. Science and knowledge will. Science and knowledge is a sacred employment of a divine gift. That's a theological thought about it, revealed in the original tree of knowledge. And meanwhile, God's with us in exile, holding our hand. So last, it's one more point I'll make, my third point, I think. And this is something I learned from Zoom. I can spend less time on it, but not because it's less important. I think Zoom is, I won't say the greatest thing known to men and women everywhere, but I think we learn from it theologically. First of all, I look at those screens and I see people all over the universe, and I suddenly discover we are all in this boat together. The pandemic has hit the entire world. And on those screens are people from all over whom I would never, ever, ever see together. And I can look at anything by anyone, and they are all my brothers and sisters in a way they never have been before. So I feel that I'm learning from the pandemic that we are really a universal species, all of whom are related to Adam and Eve, and all of whom tasted of that tree of knowledge and have knowledge that we can use for good. And I noticed that scientists are collaborating all over the world now in ways that maybe they never did before, but I didn't know it, but now I see them doing it. So I love this idea of the universal species and all of us together. The Enlightenment taught that way back in the 17th, 18th century. And we've lost that learning that really was taken for granted by so many. This country was founded on it, actually, but we've forgotten that. And not just in America, we've forgotten it everywhere. We are now living in an era of tribalism. Tribalism where it's everyone, the best for myself, and I don't care about anybody else. These are my people, no one else is. What's good for me, I do. I don't do what's good for anybody else because they're not us. It's us and them, and I'm for us, not for them. So my last point may be shorter, but I think it's the most important. I believe this callous tribalism that has overcome us here in America and in Israel, talking to Jews here in part, the proto-fascist would-be dictators worldwide for that matter, who would play on tribal sympathies and denounce everyone who is somehow different. That is not the way the world was supposed to be. I have faith as a Jew that we are all children of Adam and Eve. We are all subject to exile. We are all yearning for a home together. We are all committed to this planet. It is our home for all of us. And if it goes, we all go. We are all committed ever more strongly to oppose, I think, the tribalist bent by demanding a universal humanity in league with one another and in league with God.
Can I say amen?
You may indeed.
That's the way we always answer things at my
I
church.
love it.
Amen.
You got it.
Well, I think that I'm supposed to just say a few things in relationship to your remarks, Larry. And the first one is related to your idea of talking about God. You know, I think Christians have the opposite problem. In a way, we talk too easily about God.
Interesting.
And I think that this question that I was raising about where is God, part of the reason why I'm finding it actually offensive right now when people say, oh no, God can't work through whatever, the internet to present God's presence to the people. There's a hubris there that the leaders of certain churches and denominations say, we know how God works. And it's like, we know the mind of God, and that we know how God has decided to do everything. And, you know, I think that's really part of the problem. I mean, Christians have gone overboard, if nothing else, with things like systematic theology and our different kinds of ecclesial divides, each one insisting that we have some sort of corner, as it were, onto how God specifically acts with human beings. And so I think that sometimes Christians would do with more reticence and allow more space for God to surprise and show up. And, you know, we just have enormous problems with things like questions of silence, absence, and exile. Those are questions that Christians don't want to really
Give me
engage.
the 3 words again: silence,
absence,
and
and
exile.
exile. Yeah. And those are 3 things that I've actually felt that I've learned from 2 interesting sources. One is the monastic tradition in Christianity, which is one of the smaller, you know, it's the minor chord, as it were, of Christianity. They do talk about they talk about them. Look at that. I mean, it's so natural. Christians talk is everything. But they explore those things. But then this is the other piece that I have really benefited from Jewish theology and especially post-Holocaust thought. And I think there's much to be learned there. So anyway, Christians, I think, talk too easily about God. I just want to tell you that one of my heresies is that I don't believe in the fall, and that I believe in it exactly the way that you said it. And that's a big argument right now in Christian theology. And there are people who think that I'm not a Christian because I say that I don't believe in the fall. So there we have it.
Confession of the day, right?
It's a big confession. Oh no, now it's on tape. But I'm not the only one, but I certainly am one of the voices in Christian community for thinking about what happened post Eden differently, and that where we've gone with issues of the fall and how we understand human nature has been detrimental, I think, to many of the ethical questions that Christians and well, that human beings are facing right now. So I just wanted to underscore that, and I loved what you said about it, and it made me think. And the final thing, just in response to your remarks about Zoom, is that there was a Lutheran pastor who contacted me because she saw that I was making this strong case for the celebration of the Lord's Supper over the internet. And she had gone along with what her church was saying, to, no celebration. And then she saw the argument that I made, and she wanted to try it. And so what she did is she gathered her community via Zoom, and she invited them on the other side of the screen to have wine and bread. And she offered the prayer blessing over the wine and bread, having her own wine and bread in her house as well. And she said, when I get to the prayer, there's a part of the prayer where the minister lifts up bread and wine towards God. And so she said, when I got to the part of the prayer where we all held up the bread and wine, she had some 40 or 50 faces on her Zoom screen of her congregation.
Wow.
And she told me what happened with her as a minister. It was the first time she had ever seen the individual faces of her congregation during that prayer. Up until that moment, they'd always been this sort of mass of people sitting out in a building in pews far away from her. But she could see each person or each family unit sitting there with their bread, with their wine, and with their face. And she said it made her cry, because it was the first time that her people all had a face at the table.
Wow.
And that play on the word, we talk about having a place at the table. That's a thing Christians love to talk about. But she said they have a face at the table.
Nice.
And, theologically, I think that draws Christians and Jews actually right together too, because the idea, that of God's face, such a powerful image throughout both the Hebrew scriptures and in the Christian New Testament, and that it's this revelatory moment of our being when our faces are unmasked. And when she said the thing about faces, I also realized that right now, even if we could go into buildings and be together in community, we'd all have masks on.
Right. Wouldn't see each other.
We wouldn't see each other. And this place is the only place at this moment in time where we see one another's faces and where we are unmasked.
Wow.
And that goes right along with your whole beautiful sermon about connection and being the human family together. Because what else is there about being human and getting rid of this, fascism, this tribalism, is when we are unmasked, we see each other fully as human. And we can do that here. And I think that it's an unexpected gift of the moment.
Well, it's my turn to say amen to that. Amen. That takes my breath away. It's a magnificent image, it really is. When you describe the issue in your church of oh well, we can't do that here because you can only do it in a church where God is. And so after all, the Eucharist is something that can't happen in your home. And it has to be done by a priest, let's say. That reminded me, of course, of the claim that was made when the temple fell in the Bible. And Jews thought that's where God lived, in the temple, because that's actually what the Bible said. God takes up residence there. And then the assumption in exile was that, well, we can't do anything now. And so I think the critical decision was made by Jews then that we actually could, even in Babylonia. So you remember the psalm, you know, how can I sing God's praise in a strange land? Where's God? And they argued that through then. It took a long time to get the message, because then they built the temple again. And we had to do it all over again when the temple was destroyed. And that's sort of when synagogues, as it were, became more central. We fortunately, you know, the other thing is we Jews got lucky, and I never thought of it this way, being lucky, but we never, in the power struggle, we never did very well. And Christians throughout history until recently have been in power. When Christians were in power, they took over the Roman universe, and so they imperialized religion, and they ended up with massive churches and forgot about the little simple love dinner, the agape, you know, with which it started. And so we just didn't get that lucky. I mean, or unlucky, as the case may be. We ended up with our table and our homes, and we still have rituals in our homes. Interestingly enough, the word synagogue means gathering. It's about the gathering of the people. It's not about the building. And so any place can be a synagogue for us. It's rather interesting that you who have, Christians who have it seems to me, a surer sense of we can talk about God and evoke God's presence, now want to shut down the one place that, not all Christians, not you, want to shut down the one place where God can be found. Whereas Jews who don't think that God can be limited at all aren't asking anything about where is God now. So in a way, we each have half the picture, but not the other half. I note also, by the way, that we are now in an era where neither Jews nor Christians have any power.
Yeah.
Yeah, right?
Right.
Which puts us all in the same boat and makes us more able to collaborate together. And I actually think we're entering into a rather, with a lot of work, we're entering, I would say with God's help, but actually God doesn't intervene. So it's a nice idea though, but God may intervene through our knowledge. We are able now for the first time in history to work together seriously. I liken it to that double helix, a spiritual double helix. We've been surrounding one another through time, but never coming together, never separating either. But we were tribal then. And now we're communicating, and we're still a double helix. This is a historical fact. We were born together in the same place at the same time.
Yes, we were.
Now the question is, do we make something theological out of that? And I want to do that. So I want to say theologically, we were set to be together for the long haul. And I think we're in an era now when each of us has half the answer and half the way of describing things, and together we can do wonders. And I certainly look forward to that happening. One more thing, your comment about systematics. Some Jews won't know what that means.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. It's when you'll do it better than I. But I take it what you mean is when people read a whole long book, and it's a whole system of theology, and it's supposed to be not only consistent but about everything and so on. So you can talk about, Jews would talk about Martin Buber's theology. I mean, that's a good example. You know, that's a systematics. I actually am in love with the idea of autobiographical theology.
Oh, this is why we're friends.
Oh, there you go. All right.
That's what I do.
Yeah, I know you do that. And I actually, this program that I have, in which Becky, who we'll hear from, is one of the fellows in it. It's called the Tisch Fellowship. And I train all those students to say, you are the expert in only one thing in the world, and that is your life. You know more about your life than anyone else. The question is, what do you make of it? Now, if you want to, you can make something of it psychologically, and I urge them to do it. It's good to be in therapy. If you want to, you can make something of it, you know, in terms of your history. I mean, you can do anything you want. But the one thing I urge people to do, and I think everyone on this Zoom call, as it were, everyone on this Zoom call can do this. They don't have to be systematic theologians. They can be autobiographical theologians. All they have to say is, what's my life all about? What might I say about it in theological terms that I'm willing to try out in sentences and see if it raises my consciousness to a higher level? And if so, the question is that a real way of describing who you are? I think it moves us to a higher plane. I think everybody should be a theologian.
Well, I just love that. Oh my gosh. One time someone said in my hearing, she's not a theologian, referring to me. She's a memoirist.
Ha!
And I said, well, yeah, that's what you always say to the women, you know, but the truth of it is that Martin Luther was writing his memoir. You just called it theology when he did it. And so in the Christian tradition, actually, an enormous amount of autobiographical theology, I sometimes call it memoir theology, has been written, and it's usually been written by women and people of color and folks who were kind of on the margins of the institution, because all we really had were we didn't have access to the ancient languages or the big libraries or all those sorts of things, and so we had our lives as the primary material from which to make to draw these pictures. I love what you said about drawing lofty pictures of these questions, you know, of the cosmic picture that gives us hope, and to make our lives the stuff of that picture. I think it certainly has been the task that I've been modeling for 25 years now, and encouraging my tradition to embrace fully instead of dismissing it. Oh, it's just memoir. That's what the women write. And to recognize that all of the big names in Christian history, like Augustine and Aquinas, they were effectively writing memoirs.
They were. That's right too. That's right. Well, I can see why I admire you. You know, it occurs to me, of course, that Judaism too had women who wrote things and weren't allowed to write in the official canon. And so we have women in our history too who wrote memoirs. And if you look at them, they are religious theological memoirs, because that was the language that was the only language they had to describe their lives in. They hadn't discovered, you know, no one had discovered psychoanalysis yet. And, you know, so that was the language that they in fact did use. And now that I think of it, there are some men too who did that actually. But this stuff was never taken seriously, neither by men nor by women. Actually, there was a process in the Middle Ages by which people wrote ethical wills in which they talked about their lives. And they said, this is what I've learned in my life. And here's what I want you to know, my daughter, my son. And I'm not just leaving you my wealth of goods, I'm leaving you my wealth of wisdom about my life. Listen to this. So but it didn't become mainstream. And I think it should be.
You know, when
I'm going to jump in. I'd like to jump in here. You're having a great conversation, but the questions are piling into our chat box. This has been fascinating. I'm going to I want to ask a question. I want to frame a question before I go to the next question. It seems that you're both in agreement that I think that exile is somehow, from both of our traditions, that exile is somehow integral, unavoidable in terms of the human condition. In a sense, this pandemic has just underlined the sense that in some way we are always in a position of exile. Do you both, this is a question that came in, do you both kind of agree with that sense that the pandemic has simply underlined a certain situation that we are always in existentially?
Diana, do you want to start? Do you want to?
I'd just like to say very quickly, you know, Christians try to avoid the category of exile by doing what Larry had already said, sort of winning the historical, political, imperial argument. And so if you're in charge of the Roman Empire, you're not thinking so much of exile. And so a lot of Christian history has tried to avoid it, but also very central to Christian understanding is that category. Partly because of Jesus. I mean, he was in exile, essentially. I mean, he lived in Israel, but he was a rabbi under an oppressive government, and so they had no power. And so Christianity is born in basically an oppressive exile situation, even though it's geographically born in Israel. And the New Testament itself talks about how you're supposed to be in the world, but not of the world.
Mm.
And so that's a fundamental way that Christians are called to think and imagine our relationship with the culture and the world, is that we're here, but yet there's something in our spiritual state, in our relationship with God, that makes us different from the world. And so that Christianity itself lives within that exile tension. So I do think it's integral to Christian thought, but we've buried it under our power, and the pandemic has pulled that back, and is reminding us of what exile is, and I think our relationship with Jews because of it.
Mm. I would say that it is it's necessary to the human being. People think of exile as only exile in Jewish terms. They think of it as exile only from Israel. And so, that's our home. We'll go home again, right? But in fact, exile, once you're exiled, what do? We Jews welcomed where we were. I mean, the Jews in Spain thought they were exiled from Spain. So that was not Israel, but they were exiled from Spain. And when they ended up being exiled from Spain and going across the Mediterranean and ending up in the land of Israel, it's not like they danced around a bonfire and singing Zionist songs or something like that. They were miserable. They believed they'd been exiled from home. It's complicated because just to be alive is to be in exile, because we were born, like the Talmud says, no one asked you whether you wanted to be born. We just got put here, and no one will ask you when you leave. And if you hang on to the world too much, like I really belong here and I own it, you'll discover you don't. Why are we born with clenched hands? Because we think we can have it all. Why are we born, says the Talmud, with our hands open? Well, it's because in fact we realize we have to leave it all behind. So in fact, this is our exile. We're never fully at home. And on the other hand, we embrace it. We embrace the world. The world is ours to work in. But we always know we are visitors on the planet. We won't be here forever. And we always risk being exiled from even the most wonderful time and place. COVID is that kind of exile for all humanity. That's the point.
I want to follow up. I'm sorry, I want to expand this question if it's okay for a second, because exile, and you both spoke, Diane, you spoke about the table being taken away and God's presence, in a sense, being taken away. So I want to read this question. It has a couple of parts, but maybe both of you can respond. This questioner wrote, Judaism has a similar idea of presence for certain prayers. Some prayers require a minyan, a group of 10 Jews in person, a prayer quorum to pray together. Some Jewish communities are also struggling with what constitutes a minyan. What does presence mean? To hear each other, to see each other, physical proximity? If so, how close? It's not just how do we find community, but how do we define presence?
Wow.
That's a question, isn't it?
Is that a question? And
well, that's
yes.
the question that's being argued about in Christianity right now. Ours is, I knew that you had the 10, it's 10 is a
10, yes.
Yeah, and in Christianity, it's where 2 or 3 are gathered. I am in their midst. And so the question has emerged for us is what does it mean to have 2 or 3 gathered?
Right. So we have different concepts of community. We also have the concept of 2 or 3 gathered. So you have the saying, I think Mark, Gospel of Mark, maybe. I'm not sure, maybe Mark. If 2 or 3 gather in your name, then Christ is present. So we have the notion of 2 or 3 gathered in Torah, in which case God is present. Same idea, but the idea is that you're best off not being alone. We're not intended to be alone. That does become the idea of a minyan. And the idea of a minyan is that there's certain prayers that you can't say unless you have 10, and there are debates about that. Some Jews, however, feel that a minyan is ideal, but it's not necessary. So when you can't have 10, then you don't. The question is not what would be ideal, but what happens when you can't have the ideal? Then you give up the presence altogether, to use the term presence. My position is that you don't. There's actually a responsum about whether it's a commandment, a mitzvah, to visit the sick in person. But what if you can't visit the sick in person? Somebody asked a long time ago. And a very great Orthodox rabbi, very, very fine rabbi, asks, do you have to be there? And he says, well, ideally, yes. There's nothing like your presence. But if you can't, then you can phone. That's the next best thing. So I think nobody here debates whether it would be a good idea or not a good idea to have community. We all know we should have community for all sorts of reasons, theological as well as psychological, sociological. But if you can't have it, then the question is, does God abandon us? And do our rituals die? And do we then shrink and shrivel into nothing spiritually? And for my part, anyway, I can't imagine why that would have to be the answer, though I don't presume to speak for Christian theology, which I have a great deal of respect for. But knowing the debate as you've outlined it, I would obviously be in your corner.
And there are questions, I mean, in a very real way, this is not the first time that we've had to answer these questions. It's the first time we've answered them in relationship with technology that's so readily available, not to everyone, but to many, 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 many people. But we have stories through Christian tradition, and I know you must have these same stories in Judaism. For example, a person being held captive somewhere, or being in solitary confinement wrongly in a prison, and that person was a Christian, and yet even in those incredibly isolated situations, when a piece of bread was given as a scrap of food through a door, the person blessed it. And
you're muted, I think.
Oh, I can see myself. Danny, can you hear me?
I can hear.
Okay. So a person who was held as a prisoner, for example, we have these examples of them blessing bread and talking about God's presence, even with like a bug crawling across the floor, so it was like they were not the only living thing in this cell.
I can't hear you. I'm not sure why.
I don't know what that would be.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear. I'm going to go into the technological. I'm going to find out, but you keep talking so I can hear. Keep going, Diana.
I was just saying that whole idea of people in very isolated circumstances still celebrating communion because there was a recognition that God was present even in the sort of the depths of isolation. And so the 2 or 3 human beings weren't gathered, but somehow presence reached even there.
I would like to jump in now and also ask another question, and also thank you as well for everything that you've brought into the space. Very briefly, this conversation has alluded to the video of the murder of George Floyd, and I'm wondering if those understandings of faith during this time of the pandemic have changed for you since the political and racial conflicts that we have faced, not just in this country, but all over the world, have also surfaced in a way that sometimes does not seem like it can be divorced from the current pandemic. Specifically, in terms of the sense of exile, I'm wondering if the concept of exile applies to more people in the world than others, perhaps, or if you see faith as a response to that theological posture that will help us empathize more with other human beings, etc.
So I'll take a first stab at that, if that's all right. One of the, I didn't get a chance to say it, I probably should have, actually. One of the things you learn from the story of Adam and Eve and exile is that Judaism then draws a dichotomy between exile and home. And they make, and all of history is divided into this. Exile is bad, exile is hard, home is what you yearn for, home is the end of the Bible, back from Babylonia and so on. So I take it that I believe that homelessness and those who aren't at home, that's a specifically Jewish issue, because we know what it is not to be at home, and we know what it is to be homeless, and we know what it is to be persecuted and not to feel at home in the society where everybody thought everything's fine and all right with the world. So I would like to be able to say that I live every day with sufficient consciousness of what it is to live in a Black community in our land, or to be different, and I mentioned refugees, there's another case. And I know that I don't always think about that as much as I should, though I try to. So I think the COVID has drummed home to us, should have already, even before the murder, because we know who gets killed and who dies most in the COVID, right? So this is just, again, a reminder to me, that there are people in our country who are simply not at home and haven't been given a home and haven't been treated well enough to call it home. And that is a sin. That is a sin of all sins if you say that the issue is exile versus home. And that's why I wanted to end with the notion of universality and of all of us, because I think that's what calls out most now. And I consider the worst problem that we have in our country right now, not the COVID. We'll solve the COVID. That's just a matter of knowledge. We'll get that. But will we solve the problem of racism, and will we solve the problem of people who are just not given a home? Will we solve the problem of the refugees? Will we solve the problem of humanity? We've got the knowledge to do that, actually. The issue there is the will, and as long as people take a tribalist perspective on things, then we simply won't have the will to do it.
I was very struck by the fact that I believe it was Pew who came out with a poll this week that showed the attitudes of different religious groups towards issues related to African Americans and racism. And of all the different religious groups in America, the Jews had the highest understanding of the situation of racism and policing and other forms of discrimination. And I mean, it was like 98% of Jews came up on this scale that Pew invented about awareness of race and racial issues. And I'm ashamed to say that mainline Protestants, my tradition was in the low 50s. And we're supposed to be the liberal, the white liberal people. And you were 30, 40 points ahead of us. So another thing for us to really pay attention to and learn. A nicer answer to your question, Becky, is I was really struck. I did not go out on the streets, but lots of my friends did, despite COVID. A lot of people I know were protesting out in the streets. And some of you probably saw it, but there was one night when everyone was gathered in front of St. John's Church, where President Trump had gone to hold up the Bible and make a point. And now it's become kind of a central location for protesting. And it's kind of beautiful. But one night there was a big group of people there, thousands of people. And the crowd started singing "Lean on Me."
Mm.
You know, I just thought to myself, isn't this amazing? Even in the middle of a pandemic, when we're supposed to be quarantined, all these people, thousands of people, go out into the street to stand up for the rights of their brothers and sisters and the safety of their brothers and sisters. And what song do they start singing on the street? As a song about community. When you're not strong, you know, you've got this hand, you know, reach out, lean on me. And it was, I watched that video probably 3 or 4 dozen times now, and every time I've watched it, it makes me cry. Because there's something so human about it. It's so beautiful. Speaks right to where we're trying to talk tonight. And it was holy. I mean, that's what I felt when I was watching it. God was present in that. Whatever that moment is, compassion and love and fearlessness and courage and all those things. Wow. It was really something.
That kind of thinking of yours, Diane, comes through in your book, Grounded. When people are kind of gathered on the street, in other words, the holy expression in our era so often takes place outside of the church building. And you have example after example of that in your book, Grounded, and this is a beautiful example of that. Larry, I want to ask you one question, because you've referred to home and exile, and I just want to, I'm with you on all of it. Do you think, in terms of the evolution of our Bible, at the end of the first part of our canon, it ends with Moses in exile, we're not yet in the promised land, and as if to say that the story is, the answer to the question is always beyond the horizon. You know, we're not quite going to get there. We may get to the border, but we're not quite going to get there. And then, but then, as if, well, they want kind of a happier ending to the story, so they then add the next section of the rest of it, because they just don't want to end with Deuteronomy with Moses at the edge. But the story is, no one ever lives to see the end of the story. So it's almost exile in the aspiration for home, but home is always a sense of incompleteness, if that's a word. Do you agree with that?
Wow. That's a very interesting observation. I have to think about that. My first thought would be, Moses represents the human condition as an individual. He's plucked out of the water, and he's a stranger in a strange land. All his life, he's in exile himself from his own self, struggling while he's in Egypt. He could have been a happy prince, but he wasn't. Then he has to go to the desert to find God at a stupid burning bush. And he's constantly separated from the Israelites. He's never really at home with them. He struggles with them constantly, and he's really all alone. And in the end, he dies alone. The good news is, of course, he dies alone knowing that he's done his part in the human drama. And so he's prepared to die alone. And according to tradition, he dies with a kiss from God. That's the way I want to go,
Mm-hmm.
And it's as if he was constantly in exile himself, but he found home by identifying with the divine cause and being part of something greater than himself in time and place. He never had a place, and he never and his time was at a joint. But he realizes that he's part of eternity, and he's part of a place yet to come. The rest of the Bible fills that in. And he could be very comfortable eventually, because they find a temple and everything looks just perfect. So I like the way the Bible says, oh no, just when you think you're at home, you're not. And of course, it ends with the hope of being at home again. But we kind of suspect, if you're a careful reader, that it won't be. So I think Moses represents, taking from your example, my first thought would be, Moses represents the human person in constant exile, but identifying with something greater than themselves. And the Bible story represents the struggle, being in exile and always searching for home. And of course, it's always, the ultimate is beyond, which is why we think it's all about the time to come. But once again, if we didn't have those pictures and talk theologically about it, then we wouldn't know it. We would say, oh, well, it's a very interesting Bible story. Most of it's not true. Thank you very much. I'll pick up, it's false news, fake news, we'd say, and because we know so much of it didn't actually happen the way they say. Why do we read it if not for the theological stories? And it's not just stupid Bible stories for kids. What's the point of that? The point is, what can adults learn from these stories? We tend to think that the stories are just for children. We don't even tell them to one another anymore. I like to say Judaism is not for kids, it's for adults. It's interesting that Moses went up Mount Sinai, he didn't send the kids.
It's not like the camping trip.
Yeah, great youth group, a project, right?
That's right.
Yeah, you come down, you'll make a model of what you saw.
I'd like to lift up a question that we have in our chat. And the question is, would any of the panelists care to speculate on what the medium or long-term impacts of the pandemic will be on how the people practice their faith? And it's coupled with will there be any lasting implications?
I know the answer to the second question, yes, there will be lasting implications. I'll let Diane answer the first question. I really don't know. I mean, I think to project now what we will learn in the future is, for me anyway, it's too early to say. But I do know there will be changes. I'll stick to the theological issue, if I may, and I'll say I won't talk about how it'll impact. I mean, I'm very interested in this. I'm a liturgist by trade. I'm interested in how worship works. This is fascinating. That's what I've done for, 50 years of my life. But I won't go there. I'll stay with the theological theme. So building on what Diana said before about how this is the one place now where you see faces, and the story she told about seeing everybody's face on the screen and what that was like, So I remember a tale that's told, put in the mouth of a Hasidic rabbi. I rather doubt it was. Who knows who said it? But it's somebody who lived in modern times anyway, in America perhaps. And the story goes as follows: from every technological innovation, we learn something. So from the telegram, we learned that every word is heard, every word you say is counted, and it costs. And from the telephone, we learn that whatever we say here is heard over there. So I think to myself, what can I learn from Zoom? And I think that what we learn from Zoom is that the human face is the way to God. So I hope actually that if the questioner wonders, will we have any lessons to carry? The theological lesson to carry will be to attend to the human face, to look into one another's eyes, and not to drift back into the way we were, not to see the person. Seeing means identifying with the person face to face. It's the way God saw Moses face to face. And only when you see one face to face do you really know them. So the message is we exist as a human community to know one another, and therefore to identify with one's face.
And I'm thinking, obviously along similar lines, this idea of the intimacy of our faces, because we do see each other so much more closely than we've seen each other before. I can't ever think of a time, Larry, when I've sat here and seen your face so close on the screen,
Exactly. Right. That's the point.
Yeah. And I mean, it's amazing. And I think of this idea of unmasking as well, masking and unmasking. And there's been a lot of sort of conversation in Christian circles. We love the word apocalypse, and apocalypse means, in the popular imagination, this horrible thing about the book of Revelation and the end of the earth. And, Christians get so obsessed with talking about that. But what the word really means, of course, in Greek is the unveiling. It's the pulling back of the veil. And so in a very real sense, we're going through an apocalypse right now, where Even though ironically we have to wear masks in public, the veils are being pulled back. And so we're seeing things that we didn't maybe want to see before, about economic inequality, about racism,
That's right.
about our healthcare system. I mean, everything that people have been saying is unfair. We now see it to be incredibly unfair. And people who were sitting on the fence about things are saying, no, this has to change. And so I think that kind of urgency will remain, and that once things are unmasked, once we've been through the apocalypse, the unveiling, it's very hard to just, throw the sheet back over everything and say it's going to be fine. And so there's a level of sight and seeing that is going to change things profoundly.
Perhaps that's maybe the knowledge that will bring us to that redemption. One of our guests tonight had said that has asked, hasn't Zoom moved some marginalized people from physical exile into virtual presence and reality? Referring to the video that you were talking about, Dr. Butler Bass, and how the phone camera has made some of these lived experiences and truths, realities, allow us to see other truths that we don't experience, have that knowledge. And like Larry, like you said, kind of like, let us see the faces of people we don't get to see in that exchange.
Hasn't there been an intimacy too? This is just kind of wacky, but thinking about it, an intimacy too about people's homes. I mean, I'm kind of intrigued by Rate Your Room and all those different things, but all these reporters and journalists whose books I've loved, I've only seen them on sets before, and now I know what their living rooms look like, at least what they want me to think their living rooms look like. And so not only are we seeing people's faces, but we're somehow seeing the places they inhabit and the tokens of things that they care enough about to put behind them in the picture that communicates something about them. There's a real intimacy about all of this that has been quite beautiful.
Yeah, isn't it ironic that in a way, to go back to the problem that you raised first in your church, that the place where people call home and where they feel most at home, possibly, and the place that's intimately associated with who they are, is the place that some people want to say is not holy enough for God's presence, right?
Yes.
It just hurts. And in we're looking at the high holy days coming up. And one of the things that I've argued is that one of the things that Zoom allows us to do now is that we can actually use our homes as part of the service. Up until now, we had to rush through dinner and then run off to the synagogue or something like that. Or you on Saturday morning, or rather not Saturday, but the morning of the holiday, services would be normally too long, however long that is, too long. And then you'd run home starved and you eat. But now we're actually able to integrate the spirit of the holidays with our homes and add to the sanctity of them. So we're breaking down the boundary between home on one hand and synagogue on the other, which I think is a long-term trend, to go back to the earlier question, that we might learn a lot from.
Mm-hmm. That's happening in some Christian circles too. The people who are breaking the rules, and this is the thing that the denominational authorities don't want to admit, is that many people are breaking the rules, and they're setting up home altars. I've also gotten letters about this. Someone wrote me a beautiful letter about how she's just doing communion in her own home. She's a cancer patient. She's a wonderful human being, amazing. She's become quite disfigured. It was a cancer of her face. And so she wasn't participating in her community nearly as much anyway, because she felt kind of weird, about being in public. But she set up this home altar, and she literally did it by fishing around in her grandmother's stuff and she found this beautiful antique damask tablecloth, and she put it over the table, and she went and she got the best silver and beautiful old pieces of china that hadn't been used for years, and she's created this holy place in her
It's
home.
lovely. Lovely.
And she said she feels closer to God there than she had in church in years, because somehow the disfiguration of her face had separated her from her community.
She was in exile.
Yeah, and now she can do the Eucharist through online because she found a place that's breaking the rules, and so she is happy to join them and break the rules. And so, but she loves this spot in her home.
One of the challenges that we will face when this is over is that many people will discover they really liked what was going on in their home.
Right.
And there will be there will be those rabbis in our community, right? Pastors, rabbis, priests who decide that they want to continue home services. Why not? In which case there will be a challenge to the existing religious institutions to make their worship more compelling, more sacred, more moving, and more communal. And if they just continue doing business as usual, the drift away will continue. But it may not be a way to secularity, which is what it has been, because there was no alternative. The drift may be to an alternative form of religious consciousness that you were talking about actually in your books. You discussed the possibility of this, but it'll be towards when you know better than I, towards a kind of religious consciousness that, especially now, we know you can have. It means that your home can be the sacred place, and you can invite whatever community you like, and you can open it up even to as many people as you want. And you can develop this beautiful idea of people who have altars in their own home. I mean, I don't want to make a Christian theological judgment there. It's not for me to do that. But the beauty of it, the image of this woman, that'll stay with me. And imagine 10 people each of whom decides to do that. Now, by making that kind of altar with what that person loved most of her grandmother and so forth in her life, that's the equivalent of autobiographical theology, right? But it's a theology with not just words. And I said words before, but we never just talk in words. We always talk in sound. I mean, that's why you need music, and why we're going to end tonight, I think, with some music, because in fact, words are insufficient ultimately. You need things, you need place, you need the beauty of all the arts that can come together. But that is autobiographical theology if she's doing it herself, and to be able to share that with someone, that's a sacred thing.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pause this for 1 second. We're getting close to the time we've set at our deadline. I want to invite both Diane and you, Larry. This has been a fabulous and rich conversation, which we could carry on and on and on. And maybe at some point, depending on how long this pandemic lasts, we'll be able to keep our technology of Zoom going, and we'll continue the conversation. But I wonder if each of you would take a couple minutes to share any final thoughts, any final kind of message or takeaway that you'd like all of us that are with you this evening we don't have to take them home. We're at our homes, kind of to continue to think about as we go about the rest of our evenings in our homes.
Well, we made you go first, so I'll let you go last, Diane, if that's all right. You can bookend this wonderful hour and a half.
I love listening to you, Larry. You can just keep going.
Well, I want to get mine out of the way so I can pay attention to you. I want to thank Temple Micah for this wonderful opportunity. It's such a wonderful thing to be able to share this with you. And Diana, I'm grateful beyond belief for this opportunity to be with you in dialogue. I had some thoughts about what I would say at the end, but I scrapped them, and there's something else that came to mind. I think I'm still struck by the image of Zoom and that picture of seeing everybody's face and being masked outside, and this is the only place you can see people's face, and learning to see into people's faces, as I added afterward. So there's a line in Psalms that's part of our grace after meals. You say grace after meals, not before. And the line is, in the Hebrew is Nar Hayiti, Gamza Kanti, V'lo Ra'iti, Sadik Nezav, V'zaro Mavakesh Lachem. And it translates as, I was young and I grew older, and I've never seen the righteous abandoned and their children hunting for bread. Well, that's quite a statement since it's not true. And whatever the psalmist meant by it, it somehow gets put into our prayers. Why would anybody add it to our prayers, for goodness sake, at the time of saying thank you for our food, when it's just not true? So there are a lot of Jews who won't say it, actually. And in fact, there are some very fine Orthodox Jewish authorities who didn't feel comfortable not saying it because it was part of what you're supposed to do. But one of them anyway wrote a prayer book, and he put it in very small script without the vowels, so you can't really say it out loud. And we hear of people who kind of slurred over it, you know, well, we got to do it, but we're not going to really pay attention to it. So that line intrigues me, and I want to read it differently. So instead of saying, I was young and I've grown old and I've never seen a righteous person suffer, etc., and their children seeking bread, I would put a period in the middle. If you can get the original Bible doesn't have periods and commas and things, we add them. And so we added, we're the ones who decided it's a complete sentence. But I'd like to read it as, I was young and I've grown old and I've never seen, period. There are righteous people who are suffering, abandoned, and there are people and their children look hungry for bread. So I think one of the things we learned from this COVID thing is we've seen people suffering. And it's not like they weren't suffering before. We know that from what's going on in the streets around us and from the murder that has taken place in our American community, more than one should be said, right? But Mr. Floyd's death showed us what we weren't seeing. So I want to end with the lesson, a theological lesson that God intended us to see. God doesn't enter history, we have to do that. And the knowledge is not enough if we don't actually see. And so maybe out of all this, we'll really learn to see. And when it all goes away and we're back on the streets, we will actually not just take off the masks so people can't see us, but we'll take off whatever blinders we have that prevent us from seeing other people. And perhaps we will help everyone free themselves from exile.
Well, I don't even hardly know what to add, except that there's been a beauty here that I didn't anticipate tonight. And that beauty has come from small things. Sometimes I think when we talk about God or community or pandemic or global climate change or racism, we start talking about these huge things. But the funny rhythm of this conversation has been to talk about the books on our shelves and damask tablecloths and bread and wine and seeing the wrinkles in one another's faces and hearing voices that we hadn't heard before and crying with a man lying on a street that probably none of us have even walked on, but feeling his pain. And so, I don't know, maybe there's a holiness of intimacy that's emerging in all of this that does help us answer those big questions about where is God? Mm-hmm. God is in and through and with each and every one of us. God is with us as individuals. We matter. And somehow together we're called to make a more just and loving, compassionate community.
Lovely.
I just want to thank both of you enormously. On behalf of the Micah community, I feel truly blessed to have two such wonderful teachers that I can be with and learn with. I just want to thank you. You've created a wonderful evening for us, and I will look forward to seeing both of your faces, panim el panim, face to face, when we have a chance. In the meantime, Zoom will have to do. So thank you so much. And you will now hear me say words that are familiar to many Temple Micah people. I'm going to invite our wonderful, gifted friend, Deborah, to take us home, even though we are all currently at home. Deborah, take us home.
We are at home, and that comes with a certain intimacy. We have a guest on my screen who's not usually part of our services. This is Frisco, and he will maybe join me in singing this song, these words by Rabbis David Paskin and Menachem Creditor. There's a lot that we don't have right now, but there's also a lot that we do. So we'll focus on that. There is hope. There is healing. There is peace. And there is blessing. There is hope. There is healing, there is peace, there is blessing. When the waters are wide and you cannot reach the other side, should your courage run dry, there is hope. There is healing, there is peace, and there is blessing, there is hope. There is healing, there is peace, and there is blessing. What you try to endure when the future's unsure, believe there's something more. There is hope. There is healing. There is peace. And there is blessing. There is home. There is healing. There is peace. And there is blessing.
Good night, all. Thank you so much.